The Crusades were not about prayers, but about empty stomachs and the brutal cold in Europe. By the 11th century, Europe had frozen over properly. There were no harvests, nothing to eat, and firewood was worth its weight in gold. Feudal lords quickly realized, if you stay home, you die. The Vatican simply tossed out an idea on how to package the mass looting of southern neighbors into a legal scheme. Under the guise of a holy war, millions of people were driven to where it was warm and there were working farms. It was an ordinary raid by a gang of hungry savages on the wealthy and sunny south. When there is frost and empty pots at home, any mugging in the east is easily declared the will of God. Prayers ended where the ground froze a meter deep and stopped bearing fruit. By the end of the 11th century, Europe fell into a climatic trap. The Little Ice Age began, resetting the entire economy. Winters became abnormally long and summers short and damp. Wheat, the staple of the diet, simply did not have time to ripen and rotted in the fields. The growing season shortened so much that reserves were insufficient even for sowing. Systemic famine began in Gaul and the German lands, reaching the point of cannibalism. At the same time, merchants' reports insisted, in the east everything is stable. The sun blazes there, irrigation systems work, and the soil yields 2 harvests a year. The difference in living standards became critical. Feudal lords realized either they freeze in their castles or they move an army to where the agricultural cycle is not interrupted by frosts. The spiritual impulse had a clear base, fleeing from a climate disaster zone to a zone of eternal food abundance. People went not for the salvation of the soul, but for functioning agriculture. The Crusader went not to shrines, but to where summer lasts longer and the earth does not turn to ice in the middle of August. The Holy Host was an army of armed freeloaders whom it was cheaper to kick out the door than to feed. 11th century Europe was being torn apart by a demographic crisis. The law of primogeniture was in effect. The eldest son took the entire inheritance, from the castle to the last cow. Younger brothers were left with nothing. As a result, thousands of professional killers in armor roamed the roads with empty pockets and ambitions for an entire kingdom. This critical mass of landless knights became a toxic asset. They produced nothing but chaos, looting, and endless feuds over the remains of resources. Authorities and the church urgently needed to dispose of this gang before it tore Europe apart from the inside. The Crusade became the ideal deportation program. They were told directly, "There is nothing for you at home, but there is plenty of land in the east. Go and take it." The Vatican simply opened the cage and directed the aggressive crowd toward an external enemy. It was not an army of faith, but the export of crime and social tension to a land far away under a plausible pretext. The cross on the cloak was a severance package for those who, back home, were entitled only to a noose or a hungry death in a roadside ditch. God is the most effective lawyer, legalizing the theft of others' property on an especially large scale. In order to pull off a mass seizure of territories on the other side of the world, an ironclad legal justification was needed. Simply going and cutting a neighbor's throat for his granary is a sin and a felony. But if you call it the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre, the rules of the game change abruptly. The Vatican developed the perfect marketing strategy. The invaders were declared pilgrims and their swords, an instrument of divine will. Religion created an ethical cocoon within which any war crime turned into a heroic feat. The trump card was the full remission of sins. Soldiers were given a carte blanche: kill, loot, rape, and take others' homes. Everything was already forgiven in advance. This allowed the gathering of the most deranged mercenaries and fanatics, who now had no breaks, under one banner. All this sacred rhetoric was needed only to mask a banal redistribution of assets. While preachers shouted about saving the soul, knights mentally calculated the cost per square meter of captured gardens and markets in the east. The sermon at Clermont was not about faith, but about how to legally seize someone else's property by hiding behind the name of God. Knights traded their icy swamps and meager wastes for the working farms of the East. The main difference between Europe and the Middle East in the 11th century lay not in religion, but in the productivity of the land. In Europe, they plowed thin, frozen soils that yielded a miserable harvest. In the East, however, the Crusaders saw a completely different level. Ancient irrigation systems, established canals, and a sun that allowed the soil to work to its maximum. The capture of Antioch, Edessa, or Jerusalem was primarily the capture of fertile valleys where dates, olives, and wheat grew practically by themselves. European feudal lords behaved like typical colonizers. Having seized a patch of land, they did not build new cities, but instantly turned Arab gardens into their personal estates. They introduced their usual system of levies there, but on much richer soil. This was a seizure of the solar resource that physically did not exist in freezing Europe. The war was fought for the right to own land that does not require prayers for rain and does not freeze over in August, providing the owner a comfortable life at the expense of others' labor and others' technologies. The Holy Land was valuable not for its biblical stories, but because one could collect 2 harvests a year there, while people at home were eating tree bark. The path to heaven became the perfect one-way ticket for millions of poor people who were in the authorities' way. Europe was overflowing with hungry peasants who, due to the climate crisis, had turned into a dangerous, uncontrollable mass. Crowds of paupers in cities are always a risk for riots and epidemics. Kings and the church played a brilliant move. They promised these people mountains of gold and the salvation of their souls if they left for the East. The so-called People's Crusades were a form of mass forced deportation. People were sold a fairy tale about rivers of milk so they would simply stand up and walk out of Europe. In fact, the authorities organized a giant death column. Huge crowds of the poor, without proper weapons or provisions, set off for thousands of kilometers. Most died of hunger, disease, or in minor skirmishes without ever reaching Jerusalem. But that was exactly the goal. States were getting rid of extra mouths and potential revolutionaries, clearing living space. The few who survived to the end were used as cannon fodder and cheap labor to maintain the newly captured territories. The crusade worked like a sewage valve. It released the pressure of social discontent by sending all the surplus to die in the desert to the sound of bells. Behind the talk of saving souls was a thirst to sit at the cash register in the main ports of the Mediterranean. Before the Crusades, all Eastern trade was in the hands of the Arabs. Pepper, ginger, and silk cost exorbitant amounts in Europe because every intermediary along the way added their percentage. Italian trading corporations, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, quickly realized if the Holy Host captured port terminals like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa, then the Arab intermediaries could simply be kicked out of the scheme. They financed the knights not out of piety, but in exchange for exclusive trade rights and entire quarters in captured cities. As soon as the ports fell, the Europeans set up their own customs posts there. Now all the gold that previously went to Baghdad or Cairo flowed straight into the pockets of the Venetian doges. The religious war allowed for a brutal market clearing and the establishment of a monopoly. The seizure of the Levant coast turned the Mediterranean Sea into Europe's inner lake, where the commercial interests of merchants mattered much more than any dogmas of faith. It was pure business, packaged in the format of a crusade. The Holy War ended exactly where the full monopoly on spice sales and control over customs flows began. Byzantium hired the knights as security, and the security ended up carrying all the furniture out of the house and changing the locks. Initially, it all looked like an ordinary contract. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos appealed to Europe for help in reclaiming his lands from the Seljuk Turks. He expected disciplined mercenaries who would return his territories for a moderate fee. But instead, a crowd of fanatics and greedy barons arrived who couldn't care less about anyone else's interests. Having arrived in the East, the Crusaders quickly realized Byzantium is a rich but decrepit old man who cannot protect his property. Instead of handing over the captured cities to the rightful owner, the knights simply started squeezing them for themselves. This led to the emergence of pocket states like the Principality of Antioch or the County of Edessa. It was a classic hostile takeover. External contractors saw the client's weakness and decided it was more profitable to take the entire business for themselves. The finale of this assistance was the sacking of Constantinople in 1204, when the Crusaders finally finished off their ally, hauled away all the gold, and turned a great empire into their colonial ruins. The Crusaders were history's first private army that, instead of fulfilling its contract, carried out a brutal hostile takeover of its employer's assets. They brought back from the campaigns not only gold, but also someone else's blueprints, recipes, and scientific secrets. Europe at that time was a deep province compared to the East, dirty, illiterate, and backward. In the East, medicine, mathematics, and chemistry, which the Knights had never even heard of, were flourishing. The Crusades became a massive professional development course for the West through looting. The Knights dragged everything home, from steel-making technologies and secrets of mirror manufacturing to blueprints for windmills and advanced navigation systems. Even ordinary soap and the habit of washing became an innovation for Europeans, brought from Palestine. The war opened access to Arabic libraries, which held translations of ancient scholars long forgotten in Europe itself. The West literally sketched from the Arabs the architecture of fortresses, irrigation methods, and the basics of optics. Everything that would later be called European progress began with the banal theft of knowledge in captured cities. It was a mass transfer of intellectual property. Europe sucked all useful developments out of the East to somehow close the technological gap and modernize its lifestyle. The European Renaissance began not in the offices of scholars, but in the Arabic workshops that the Knights cleaned out under the pretext of fighting for the faith. Sitting in the desert in iron armor turned out to be too expensive for the European budget. Seizing the land was only half the battle. Holding it under conditions of total hostility turned out to be a financial hell. The Crusaders were faced with the fact that their new estates required constant and exorbitant infusions from home. Almost all the iron for weapons, thoroughbred horses, and even familiar foodstuffs had to be transported from Europe across thousands of kilometers by sea. The logistics of the Golden Hour ate up all the profits from the captured farms. The occupying army rapidly melted away from unfamiliar diseases, heat, and constant guerrilla raids. To simply maintain garrison numbers, Europe had to send ever new waves of cannon fodder, which bled the economies of the Western kingdoms themselves. When the cost of maintaining one knight in Jerusalem began to exceed the income from an entire county in France, the feudal lord's enthusiasm sharply faded. The Crusades project was shut down not because of a loss of faith, but because investors realized the debits and credits no longer balanced. The Knights left the East not so much under the blows of sabers, but under the weight of empty wallets and collapsed logistics. The Crusades did not save souls, but they turned European savages into effective predators. Looking at the raw numbers, Project Jerusalem failed. All the captured lands eventually had to be returned. But for Europe itself, it was a colossal leap forward. The clash with the developed East knocked the arrogance out of the Knights and forced them to learn. The campaigns created a powerful banking system, Hello Templars, established maritime logistics, and forced kings to consolidate their resources. Europe stopped being a collection of isolated villages and turned into a single aggressive bloc, ready for global expansion. Over hundreds of years of war, the West drained everything from the East, from technology and gold to the foundations of state administration. The price was exorbitant, millions of corpses and scorched cities. But it was this blood that became the lubricant for the gears of future capitalism. Europe emerged from the Crusades not more holy, but much more dangerous, technically equipped and greedy. It was a brutal school that taught yesterday's barbarians how to rob the world on an industrial scale and package it in a beautiful ideology. The bottom line of the Crusades was not saved shrines, but a well-oiled machine for pumping resources from east to west, which is still working today.